He sent for a simple mail-order bride to share his lonely Wyoming ranch. But the woman who showed up at his door clutching a stolen ticket was hiding a deadly secret. She brought 2 terrified little girls, hands scarred by a fire she deliberately set, and a ruthless bounty hunter right on her trail. When her haunting past finally catches up, will her desperate lie destroy the fierce rancher who took her in, or forge a love stronger than a frontier storm? Stick around to find out. Today's journey is a powerful reminder that true family isn't always forged by blood. It is built by the courageous choices we make to stand by each other in the darkest of storms. Welcome to my channel, your home for the most sweeping tales of the untamed West. If this tale captures your heart, please leave a like and hit that subscribe button to join our frontier family. Now, let's ride into today's story.
Elara hid her blistered, ash-stained hands deep within the folds of her frayed wool skirt, her fingers white-knuckling a stolen train ticket bearing another woman's name, just as the towering rancher pulled open the heavy oak door. The Wyoming wind howled like a dying animal across the plains, driving coarse, biting sand against the porch of the Broken Spur Ranch. Beside Elara, 8-year-old Cora stood rigid, her small shoulders bracketed against the gale, trying to shield her 5-year-old sister Lily. Lily didn't make a sound. She hadn't made a sound in 4 weeks. She only gripped the hem of Elara's skirt with a desperation that broke Elara's heart a little more every passing hour. The door swung fully open, groaning on heavy iron hinges. The man filling the doorframe was as harsh and unforgiving as the landscape that surrounded his property. Gideon Thorne possessed the kind of broad, weathered build forged by brutal labor and unrelenting winters. A battered Stetson was pulled low over his brow, casting deep shadows over eyes that were the color of a bruised sky. He held a kerosene lantern high, the amber light carving out the sharp, uncompromising lines of his jaw. He didn't look like a man looking for a wife. He looked like a man who had long ago given up on salvation. Gideon's gaze swept over Elara, taking in her wind-battered hair, the dust caked on her pale cheeks, and the sheer, vibrating tension in her spine. Then his eyes dropped to the piece of paper she had managed to pull from her pocket. The ticket she had found abandoned on a bench at the Cheyenne Depot, cast aside by a terrified seamstress from Ohio who had taken one look at the savage frontier and boarded a train heading right back east. Gideon's brow furrowed, a dark storm gathering in his expression. "You're supposed to be Clara Higgins." Elara swallowed the sand in her throat. She forced her chin up, meeting his imposing stare. "The West changes a person quickly, mister." Gideon didn't smile. His eyes flicked downward past the hem of her muddy skirt and landed on the 2 small, shivering figures clinging to her. The change in the man was instantaneous and violent. The lantern in his hand shook, the glass rattling against the wire cage. All the color drained from his weathered face, replaced by a pale, rigid mask of absolute horror. He took a half-step back, his chest heaving once, as if the mere sight of the children had driven a physical blade between his ribs. "What is this?" Gideon's voice was a low, dangerous gravel that cut right through the howling wind. The arrangement was clear. The agency swore to it. No children. "They are mine," Elara said, her voice trembling but her posture refusing to yield. She stepped slightly in front of the girls, a mother hen shielding her chicks from a predator. "And we have nowhere else to go." "I sent for a woman with no ties," Gideon practically snarled, though the anger seemed directed as much at the universe as it was at her. "A practical arrangement, a housekeeper, a partner to help work the land. I don't run an orphanage, and I sure as hell don't want—" He choked on the words, his gaze snapping away from the girls as if looking at them burned his eyes. "Where is the man who drove you out here?" "He dropped our bags at your gate and took off when he saw the dust storm rolling over the ridge," Elara said, gesturing behind her to the battered leather valise sitting in the dirt. "He said he wasn't risking his team for the extra quarter mile." Gideon swore under his breath, a harsh, clipped sound. He looked out past the porch. The storm was worsening, turning the twilight into a choking, blinding wall of brown dirt and debris. A man could lose his way 10 feet from his own front door in a blow like that. "You can't stay here," Gideon said, stepping back into the threshold, though his hand remained wrapped tight around the edge of the door. "There's a boarding house in Cutter's Creek, 7 miles east. I'll saddle a horse tomorrow and take you back. But you are not staying here." "I am your mail-order bride, Mr. Thorne," Ilara lied, the taste of ashes and desperation thick on her tongue. "We had an agreement." "I had an agreement with a childless woman from Ohio," Gideon fired back, his tone dropping to a dangerous quiet register. "I don't know who you are, lady, but you aren't her. Your hands are shaking, your eyes are darting like a cornered fox, and you're carrying secrets I don't want any part of." He moved to pull the door shut. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked through Ilara's veins. If he turned them away, Malachi's men would find them by nightfall tomorrow. She had burned an empire to the ground to get her daughters this far. She would not let them freeze in the Wyoming dirt. Ilara reached out, her blistered palm slamming flat against the heavy wood of the door to stop it from closing. The searing pain in her burned flesh made her gasp, but she didn't pull away. Before she could beg, before she could offer to sleep in the dirt just to keep her daughters under a roof, movement at her side caught Gideon's eye. Lily stepped out from behind Ilara's skirt. The 5-year-old was painfully thin, her dark hair a tangled mess around her pale, dirt-smudged face. She walked right up to the threshold, stopping inches from Gideon's scuffed leather boots. Lily didn't speak. She couldn't, not since the night Malachi's heavy fist had driven the voice right out of her throat. Instead, Lily just looked up at the towering, furious man. Her large, dark eyes were wide and hollow, carrying a weight of trauma that no child should ever know. She reached out one trembling, grubby little hand and lightly touched the knee of Gideon's denim trousers. It was a silent, desperate plea. "Please don't let us die out here." Gideon froze. He stared down at the tiny hand resting on his knee. Ilara watched his throat work as he swallowed hard. The rigid, angry line of his shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a profound, agonizing weariness. He closed his eyes for a long, heavy second. "Damn it," he whispered to the empty air. He opened his eyes, refusing to look at the children again. He met Ilara's gaze, his jaw ticking. "Get inside," he ordered gruffly, stepping aside and holding the door wide. "Before the wind blows you clear to Cheyenne." Ilara let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 400 miles. She ushered Cora and Lily out of the screaming wind and into the dim, quiet sanctuary of the cabin. Gideon Thorne didn't offer to take her coat. He didn't offer a word of welcome. He set the lantern on a heavy, rough-hewn oak table in the center of the room, bolted the heavy door against the storm, and turned to face the woman who had just lied her way into his life. "One night," Gideon said, his voice stripped of everything but cold, hard reality. He pointed a calloused finger at Ilara. "You get one night out of the storm. Tomorrow morning, I don't care if the sky is falling. I am putting you on a wagon, and you are gone." Ilara cradled her throbbing, blistered hands beneath her apron, feeling the steady, rhythmic thump of her own terrified heart. She looked around the cramped Spartan cabin, smelling the sharp scent of cedar, wood smoke, and a deeply ingrained loneliness. She met his bruised sky eyes. "We'll see about tomorrow, Mr. Thorne," she murmured. Right now she had a roof, and in the brutal, unforgiving expanse of the American West, that was enough of a start to wage a war. Morning broke over the Wyoming territory, not with sunlight, but with a bruised, sullen gray that bled through the single window of the cabin. Gideon Thorne woke with an ache in his spine, the unforgiving pine floorboards offering no comfort beneath his thin bedroll. He lay perfectly still for a moment, listening. The howling wind of the previous night had died down, replaced by the relentless, heavy drumming of a torrential downpour. He shifted his weight and opened his eyes. He was lying exactly where he had positioned himself the night before, horizontally across the threshold of the heavy oak door. His Winchester rifle rested within arm's reach. It was a habit born of living alone in wild country. But last night he had done it to ensure his unexpected guests didn't try anything foolish in the dark. He pushed himself up, rolling his broad shoulders to work out the stiffness, and looked toward the corner of the room. The cabin was agonizingly small. It was a temporary shelter built just to keep the weather off his back while he spent his days framing the main ranch house 100 yards away. It held a cast-iron stove, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a single bed. The bed was currently occupied by a tangle of worn quilts and 2 small, sleeping girls. Cora had one protective arm thrown over Lily, their dark heads pressed together. Gideon's chest tightened, a familiar suffocating grip wrapping around his lungs. 2 years. 2 years since winter fever had taken his wife, Martha, and the child she carried. He had built this ranch with the dream of filling it with children. Now the mere sight of them felt like a knife twisting in an old, unhealed wound. That was exactly why he had written to the agency for a widow with no attachments. A practical, bloodless partnership. He tore his gaze away from the bed and realized Elara was not with them. Gideon stood, boots quiet on the floorboards, and grabbed his oilskin slicker from the peg. He stepped out onto the covered porch, the cold dampness of the morning hitting him like a physical blow. The storm had turned the yard of the broken spur into a treacherous sea of thick, churning mud. The road to Cutter's Creek was completely washed out. The creek itself had crested its banks, brown water rushing violently over the wooden bridge. No wagon was getting through that today. They were marooned. A sharp, rhythmic thwack cut through the sound of the rain. Gideon stepped off the porch, boots sinking 2 inches into the muck, and rounded the corner of the cabin. He stopped dead in his tracks. There, standing by the woodblock in the pouring rain, was the woman who called herself Clara Higgins. She had tied her soaked woolen skirt up past her ankles, the hem heavy with mud. Her dark hair plastered to her neck and cheeks. In her hands, she held his heavy, splitting maul, swinging it down in an uneven but desperate arc to shatter a block of pine. Thwack! The wood splintered. She let out a ragged breath, pushed the wet hair from her eyes with a trembling forearm, and reached for another log. Gideon watched her, his brow furrowed in a deep, angry V. She was shivering violently, her lips tinged blue from the cold. But what caught his eye was the way she held them all. Her grip was tight but awkward, as if simply closing her fingers around the hickory handle was causing her excruciating pain. He closed the distance between them in 4 long strides. Before she could bring the heavy iron head down again, Gideon reached out and caught the handle mid-swing. Elara gasped, startled, her eyes wide and wild as she looked up at him. She tried to yank the maul back, a sudden, fierce defiance lighting up her pale face. "Let go of it," Gideon ordered, his voice easily cutting through the rain. "I have to earn our keep," she shot back, her breath coming in ragged pants. "I won't have you saying we took your charity, Mr. Thorne. If we're stuck here today, I will work. You're going to catch your death of cold, and then I'll have 2 orphans on my hands, which I want even less than a lying mail-order bride." He easily overpowered her, twisting the maul out of her grip. As the wood slid from her hands, Elara winced, a sharp hiss of pain escaping her clenched teeth. She immediately hid her hands behind her back, taking a defensive step away from him. Gideon narrowed his eyes. "A seamstress from Ohio," he said, his tone dripping with dark skepticism. "A woman who makes her living with fine needles and silk threads, swinging a 10-pound splitting maul in a freezing downpour." "I am adaptable," she said, her chin lifting stubbornly, rain tracking down her long neck. "You're a terrible liar," Gideon corrected, stepping closer. The sheer size of him in his dark oilskin made him look like a mountain blocking her path. "Who are you running from?" "I'm not running from anyone. I told you—" "Save it." Gideon cut her off, his voice flat. He looked down at the mud, then back to her fierce, shivering form. Despite his anger, a begrudging sliver of respect lodged itself in his chest. She was terrified. She was freezing, but she wasn't breaking. "The road to town is washed out. You get one more night. Get inside by the stove before you freeze." He turned his back on her, hoisting them all to his shoulder, and began to split the wood with effortless, brutal efficiency. Elara watched his broad back for a long moment, the tension humming between them before she gathered her wet skirts and retreated to the cabin. By nightfall, the claustrophobia of the cabin was a living, breathing thing. The rain continued to assault the tin roof in a deafening roar. After a meager supper of salted pork and beans, Cora and Lily had retreated to the bed, exhausted by the cold and the tension. Elara sat at the small table, keeping her back painfully straight. She had spent the afternoon scrubbing the cabin floor and mending a tear in Gideon's spare work shirt, fighting through the agonizing throb of the burns on her palms. She kept her cuffs rolled down, hiding the bandaged flesh. Gideon sat in the armchair by the stone hearth, a piece of leather harness in his lap, working an awl through the thick hide. He hadn't said more than 10 words to her since the woodpile. But he was watching her. She could feel the weight of his bruised sky eyes on her every time she moved. He was studying her, waiting for her to slip. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken questions and the strange, undeniable heat of two people forced into a space far too small for the secrets they carried. Gideon set the harness down and picked up an iron poker. "Fire's dying," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He reached into the woodbox and tossed a thick, resin-heavy knot of pine directly into the dying flames. He dragged the heavy iron poker across the grating to settle it. Crack! The damp sap in the pine knot exploded like a gunshot. A shower of bright, incandescent orange embers shot out from the hearth, arcing through the air. One large, glowing coal landed directly on the braided rug, inches from the hem of Elara's skirt. To Gideon, it was a nuisance. He calmly reached for his boot to stamp it out. To Elara, it was the end of the world. The sharp crack, the sudden bloom of orange light, the acrid smell of wood smoke. It didn't just startle her, it shattered reality. Suddenly, she wasn't in a cabin in Wyoming. She was back in Laramie. She could hear the roar of the barn going up in flames. She could feel the blistering, flesh-melting heat of the fire she had set to destroy Malachi's forged guardianship papers. She could see the burning rafters crashing down, trapping her, the flames licking at her hands as she fought her way out to get back to her daughters. "No!" Elara screamed, a raw, primal sound of absolute terror. She scrambled backwards so fast her wooden chair tipped over with a crash. She hit the log wall of the cabin and shrank against it, pulling her knees to her chest. Her hands flew up to protect her face, the sleeves falling back to reveal the angry red, blistered skin wrapping her palms and forearms. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she stared at the single smoking ember on the rug, as if it were a beast coming to devour her. "Hey!" Gideon dropped the poker, his boot slamming down on the coal, crushing it into dust. He looked up, annoyance flashing across his face, ready to tell her to calm down. But the words died in his throat. Elara wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were blown wide, completely unseeing. She was trembling so violently her teeth chattered. She was trapped in a nightmare, locked in a panic so profound it stole the air from the room. Gideon's annoyance vanished, replaced by a sharp, sudden alarm. He had seen men in the war look like this after a cannon shell went off too close. "Miss Higgins, he started, taking a step toward her. Elara flinched hard, pressing herself deeper into the corner, a choked sob tearing from her throat. "Don't! The roof is falling!" She babbled frantically, her eyes darting to the ceiling. Gideon didn't hesitate. He crossed the room and dropped to his knees right in front of her. He reached out and gripped her shoulders. His large, calloused hands were firm, heavy, and grounding. "Look at me," he commanded. His voice wasn't the harsh bark from the porch. It was a low, steady rumble, the tone a man uses to calm a panicked, rearing horse. Look at my eyes." Ilara gasped for air, her panicked gaze frantically searching until it locked onto his. "You're in Wyoming," Gideon said slowly, keeping his grip steady, his thumbs pressing into her collarbones. "You are in my cabin. There is no fire. It was just a spark. You are safe." She stared at him, her chest shuddering with jagged breaths. Slowly, agonizingly, the glassy terror in her eyes began to clear. The reality of the dim, quiet cabin reasserted itself. She looked down at his massive hands holding her, then up to his face. He was so close she could smell the rain and leather on his skin. As her breathing slowed, Gideon's gaze dropped. He looked at her hands, hovering defensively near her chest. He saw the angry, raised blisters, the raw, weeping burns wrapping around her palms, and the crude, desperate bandages she had tried to hide beneath her cuffs. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Gideon didn't let go of her shoulders. He slowly looked back up to her face, his eyes narrowing as the pieces of a very dark, very dangerous puzzle began to align in his mind. A woman running blindly into the frontier. A fake name. A desperate swing of a heavy axe despite agonizing pain. And a paralyzing, soul-deep terror of a single spark. "You didn't get those burns from a sewing needle, Clara," Gideon said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper that barely disturbed the air between them. Ilara swallowed hard, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was cornered. The lie was bleeding out right in front of him. Gideon stared into her frightened eyes for a long, heavy moment. He didn't demand the truth, not yet. He simply released her shoulders, stood up to his full, towering height, and righted her fallen chair. "Get some sleep," he said quietly, turning his back to her and walking toward his bedroll by the door. "The storm won't last forever. And when it breaks, we're going to have a very long talk about exactly what you left burning behind you." By the third morning, the brutal Wyoming storm had finally broken, leaving behind a pale, washed-out sky and a ranch yard drowned in thick, sucking mud. Gideon was in the corral before the sun fully cleared the jagged eastern peaks. He needed the punishing physical labor to clear his head. The revelation of the night before, the paralyzing terror in the fake Clara's eyes, the weeping burns hidden beneath her cuffs, had kept him staring at the cabin ceiling until dawn. She was running from a fire, and she had dragged two little girls into the crosshairs of whatever devil was chasing her. Inside the muddy ring of the corral, Gideon gripped a heavy hemp rope, his boots planted deep in the muck. At the other end of the line was a wild, unbroken roan Mustang he had brought down from the foothills last week. The horse was pure, unadulterated fury, 1,000 pounds of coiled muscle, rolling white eyes, and bared teeth. "Easy, you stubborn son of a bitch," Gideon grunted, his broad shoulders straining against the leather vest as the Mustang reared, its front hooves slicing through the crisp morning air. From the porch of the cabin, Ilara watched him. She held a basket of wet laundry to her chest, her breath pluming in the cold air. She had never seen a man move like Gideon Thorne. There was a raw, primal power in the way he anchored himself against the beast's wild thrashing, a quiet dominance that made her chest tighten with something she firmly refused to name. Near the fence line, Cora and Lily were playing in the damp grass, constructing a makeshift fort out of fallen pine branches. Cora had brought out a small, ragged cloth doll, the only toy they had managed to salvage from Laramie. Gideon wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his gloved hand, keeping his focus dead-locked on the Mustang. He shortened the rope, stepping into the mud, whispering low, guttural commands to bring the animal down. He didn't see Cora's doll slip from the pine branch and roll under the bottom rail of the corral fence. He didn't see the 8-year-old girl scramble onto her hands and knees, sliding beneath the heavy wooden slats to retrieve it. But the Mustang did. The sudden movement in its blind spot sent the wild horse into an absolute frenzy. The roan let out a high-pitched, terrifying shriek, bucking violently. The rope ripped through Gideon's leather gloves, burning the hide right off his palms. Gideon spun around. His blood turned to ice. Cora was frozen in the mud, clutching her cloth doll to her chest. looking up at the massive hooves descending right toward her fragile skull. "Cora!" Elara screamed from the porch, dropping the laundry basket. There was no time to pull the rope. There was no time to think. Gideon launched himself across the corral. He hit the deep mud, his powerful legs driving him forward with explosive speed. He dove just as the Mustang's front hooves came crashing down. Gideon wrapped his thick arms around Cora's small waist and tackled her out of the drop zone, twisting his own body to shield hers. They rolled hard into the muck, but Gideon didn't clear the strike zone entirely. A flying iron-shod hoof caught him squarely in the left shoulder. The sickening crack of bone and tearing flesh echoed like a gunshot across the yard. Gideon let out a raw, guttural roar of agony, collapsing into the mud, his body curled protectively over the sobbing child. The Mustang bolted to the far end of the corral, snorting and kicking at the fence. "Cora! Gideon!" Elara scrambled under the fence, her skirts dragging through the filth, her breath tearing from her lungs in jagged gasps. She reached them, falling to her knees in the mud. Cora was crying hysterically but unharmed, her small hands clutching Gideon's vest. Gideon, however, was pale beneath the dirt, his jaw locked so tight the muscles jumped. Blood was already blooming, dark and thick, seeping through the torn fabric of his flannel shirt and pooling in the mud beneath him. His left arm hung at a grotesque, unnatural angle. "Get her! Out of the pen!" Gideon ground out, his voice a tight rasp of pure agony. Elara shoved Cora toward the fence. "Go to Lily! Run!" She turned back to Gideon, her blistered hands hovering over his ruined shoulder. The sleeve was shredded, the flesh beneath laid open, and the joint was visibly, horribly dislocated. "You need a doctor," she breathed, panic rising in her throat. "Doc's in Cutter's Creek," Gideon grunted, fighting a wave of nausea as he forced himself to a sitting position. "Road's washed out. It's got to be you." "I don't know how to." "You're going to learn real fast," he interrupted, his bruised sky eyes locking onto hers with absolute, unyielding command. "Help me up." It took 10 agonizing minutes to get him out of the muddy corral and into the cabin. Every step drew a sharp hiss of pain from his lips, but he never cried out. Elara practically carried half his immense weight, the heat of his feverish skin seeping through her damp clothes. Inside, she guided him into the sturdy wooden chair by the table. Cora and Lily stood huddled in the corner, their eyes wide with terror. "Get the whiskey from the top shelf," Gideon ordered Elara, his head tipping back, sweat beading on his forehead. "And my sewing kit, bottom drawer of the chest." Elara moved with frantic precision. She retrieved the bottle of cheap rye and the leather kit. Her hands were shaking. She had treated burns, scrapes, and bruises, but she had never reset a man's bones. "Cut the shirt off," he told her. She took his hunting knife and carefully sliced the bloody flannel and the heavy long johns away from his chest and shoulder. As the ruined fabric fell away, Elara's breath hitched. Gideon Thorne was built like a fortress. His chest and abdomen were corded with thick, heavy muscle, dusted with dark hair and crisscrossed with old, faded scars that spoke of a lifetime of violence and hard labor. But her eyes snapped to his shoulder. The joint was wrenched entirely out of the socket, the skin stretched taut over the displaced bone, and a jagged 4-inch gash wept dark blood down his sculpted bicep. Gideon uncorked the whiskey with his teeth, spat the cork onto the floor, and took 3 long, punishing pulls from the bottle. He held it out to her. "Pour the rest on the cut," he commanded. Elara hesitated, knowing the agony it would cause, but she saw the fierce expectation in his eyes. She tipped the bottle. Gideon bit back a roar, his heavy muscles locking down, the veins in his neck bulging as the raw alcohol bit into the open wound. He slammed his right fist onto the table, splintering the edge of the wood, but he didn't move away. "Now the shoulder," he gasped, his chest heaving. "Put your foot against the chair leg for leverage. Grab my wrist and my elbow. When I say go, you pull forward and twist in as hard as you can. Don't stop if I yell. You have to pop it back." Elara stepped between his spread knees, her skirts brushing his thighs. The physical intimacy of the position made the air in the cramped cabin feel suddenly impossibly thick. She reached out, her small, scarred hands wrapping around his thick wrist and the heavy joint of his elbow. His skin was burning hot. She looked at his face, mere inches from hers. He was staring back, not with anger, but with a startling, absolute trust. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Do it," he rasped. Elara braced her boot against the chair, gritted her teeth, and hauled back with every ounce of strength she possessed, twisting his arm exactly as he had instructed. Gideon let out a deafening, feral shout. The heavy muscles in his shoulder fought her, resisting the movement. But she didn't let go. She pulled harder, her own blistered palm screaming in agony against his rough skin. With a sickening, wet thud, the bone snapped back into the socket. Gideon slumped forward, his uninjured arm wrapping around Elara's waist to keep himself from sliding out of the chair, his forehead dropping heavily against her stomach. He was panting, his hot breath bleeding through the thin cotton of her apron. Elara froze. Her hands hovered over his broad, bare back. Slowly, instinctively, she lowered her fingers to his skin, lightly stroking the damp hair at the nape of his neck. It was a gesture of profound comfort, an anchor in the storm of his pain. Gideon stilled against her. He didn't pull away. For a long, fragile moment, the fierce, lonely rancher simply leaned into her touch, letting her hold him together. Finally, he drew a deep breath and pushed himself back up, his face pale, but the glassy look of shock fading from his eyes. "Stitch the cut," he muttered, looking away, the sudden vulnerability between them too heavy to acknowledge. Elara nodded. She pulled a chair up close, so close their knees bumped. She threaded the bone needle with thick black silk. To do the delicate work, she had to roll her wet sleeves up past her elbows. As she leaned in, cleaning the blood away with a damp rag, Gideon's gaze dropped. With the sleeves pushed back, there was no hiding it anymore. The angry, puckered flesh of terrible burn scars covered the back of her hands, trailing up the soft undersides of her forearms. They were violent, ugly marks. The kind of marks a person gets not by accidentally touching a hot stove, but by reaching directly into a raging inferno. He watched her hands work. Despite her own injuries, her fingers were deft, precise, and surprisingly gentle as she pierced his torn skin, pulling the edges of the wound together. "I'm sorry about the horse," Elara said softly, breaking the heavy silence, keeping her eyes fixed on her stitching. "Cora, she didn't know." "She's a kid," Gideon said, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "Kids do stupid things. Doesn't mean they deserve to get trampled." Elara tied off the knot and snipped the thread. She reached for a clean bandage, wrapping it tightly over his bicep. "Thank you for saving her. I don't know how to repay you for that." Gideon looked at her face, tracing the exhausted lines around her mouth, the desperate fire in her eyes. "You can start by telling me your real name." Elara's hands stilled on the bandage. She looked up, the air between them suddenly crackling with electricity. He was bare-chested, bleeding, and beautiful in his brutal ruggedness. She was cornered, scarred, and stripped of her lies. Before she could speak, a tiny, tentative movement caught their attention. Lily stepped out from the shadows of the corner. The 5-year-old girl walked slowly toward them, her dark eyes fixed entirely on Gideon. Gideon tensed, his protective walls automatically rising. He didn't know how to be around children. He only knew how to bury them. But Lily didn't stop. She walked right up to the side of his chair. She looked at the bloody rags on the table, then up to Gideon's pale face. Slowly, the mute child reached out her small, grubby hand. She didn't touch his injury. She placed her tiny palm flat against his uninjured right knee. She patted it twice, a gentle, profound gesture of comfort. "Thank you for saving my sister." The icy fortress surrounding Gideon Thorne's heart cracked right down the middle. He stared at the child's hand, his throat constricting so tightly he couldn't draw a breath. He had spent 2 years building a wall of stone around his grief, convinced that caring for another fragile life would destroy him completely. but feeling the weight of that tiny hand, looking into the eyes of a child who had seen hell and still offered comfort. The wall shattered. Slowly, his massive, calloused hand moved down. He covered Lily's tiny hand with his own, his thumb gently brushing her knuckles. "You're welcome, little one," he whispered, his voice thick with a raw emotion he couldn't hide. Ilara watched them, a sudden, hot tear spilling over her lashes and cutting a clean path down her dusty cheek. Gideon looked up from the child, his bruised sky eyes meeting Ilara's. The suspicion and the anger were gone, replaced by something infinitely more dangerous. It was a silent, unbreakable tether forming between them in the blood-scented air of the cabin. The lie of Clara Higgins was dead. And whatever haunting truth this woman was hiding, Gideon realized with a terrifying certainty that he was no longer willing to let her face it alone. 4 days after the Mustang incident, the brutal Wyoming sun finally baked the mud of the broken spur into deep, hardened ruts. Gideon's left arm was bound tightly to his chest in a canvas sling, the dull, throbbing ache in his shoulder a constant companion. Despite the pain, there was a strange, unfamiliar lightness in his chest as he rode his buckskin gelding into the dusty main street of Cutter's Creek. He tied the horse to the hitching post outside the general store, his right hand moving awkwardly to secure the knot. Inside, he bought the supplies they desperately needed: flour, coffee, a tin of saleratus, and a fresh spool of black thread. As the clerk tallied the order, Gideon's gaze wandered to a glass jar on the counter. He stared at it for a long moment before clearing his throat. "Give me 3 of those peppermint sticks, too." He didn't analyze the impulse. He just knew that seeing the shadows recede from Lily's eyes was worth a penny piece of candy. Ever since he had taken the child's hand in the cabin, the heavy, suffocating ghost of his past had felt manageable. Ilara, whoever she truly was, hadn't offered him any more lies, and she hadn't stopped working. She had chopped wood, hauled water, and tended his wound with a fierce, quiet dedication. He was ready to ask for her real name. He was ready to figure out a way forward. Gideon stepped out of the general store, the paper bag tucked under his good arm, only to find Sheriff Eli Tate waiting for him on the boardwalk. Eli was a lean, grizzled man who had worn a tin star in Cutter's Creek for a decade. He held a crumpled, rain-spotted piece of paper in his weathered hand, his expression uncharacteristically grim. "Morning, Gid," Eli said, his eyes dropping to the sling. "Heard a roan got the better of you. Or were you just getting soft?" "I've had better weeks," Gideon replied, his tone even. "What's on your mind, Eli?" The sheriff glanced over his shoulder toward the bat-wing doors of the saloon across the street. "Got a stranger in town. Came in on the morning stage. Wears a bowler hat and a sour disposition. He's a Pinkerton." Gideon's blood cooled a fraction. Pinkerton National Detective Agency men didn't come to Cutter's Creek for their health. They came hunting. "Who's he looking for?" Eli handed Gideon the paper. "A woman. Says she fled Laramie County about 3 weeks ago. Got a hefty bounty on her head put up by a wealthy landowner." Gideon looked down at the paper. It was a hand-drawn sketch reproduced on a printing press. The air in Gideon's lungs vanished. The artist had captured the sharp, elegant slope of her jaw, the stubborn set of her mouth, and the desperate, cornered animal intensity in her eyes. It was the face he had studied by the dim light of a kerosene lantern. It was the face he had caught himself staring at when she wasn't looking. Beneath the sketch, bold black letters screamed, "Wanted for arson and attempted murder." Ilara Vance travels with 2 female children, extremely dangerous. "Arson," Gideon whispered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. The puzzle pieces slammed together with a violent, sickening force. The fake name, the absolute soul-shattering terror when the ember hit the rug. The horrific puckered burn scars wrapping her hands and forearms. She wasn't just running from a bad situation. She had burned a man's property to the ground and nearly killed him in the process. She was a wanted fugitive, and Gideon was harboring her. He had let an accused murderer sleep under the same roof as his guns. He had let her tend his wounds. Pinkerton says she torched a thoroughbred stable and an estate office in the dead of night, Eli continued, oblivious to the war raging inside Gideon. Owner barely got out alive. Word is she might have headed into the high country. You seen anyone matching that description riding past the broken spur, Gid? Gideon stared at the drawing of Elara Vance. The peppermint sticks in the paper bag suddenly felt like lead weights. Betrayal, hot and bitter, flared in his gut. She had played him. She had used his grief and his isolation to build a fortress for herself. But then he remembered the agonizing twist of her hands as she reset his bone, enduring her own pain to save his arm. He remembered Cora, throwing herself into the mud to save a ragged doll. He remembered the fragile, trembling touch of Lily's hand on his knee. Extremely dangerous. Gideon folded the paper in half and handed it back to the sheriff. His face was a mask of carved granite. "No," Gideon lied, looking his oldest friend dead in the eye. "Haven't seen a soul, Eli. I'll keep my rifle handy, though." "You do that," Eli warned. "Pinkerton's renting a horse. Says he's going to start sweeping the outlying ranches by tomorrow morning. Man named Amos Slate, cold fish. I wouldn't cross him." Gideon didn't reply. He untied his gelding, mounted with a grimace of pain from his shoulder, and kicked the horse into a hard, punishing gallop. He rode like the devil was on his heels. The Wyoming sky, as if sensing the impending collision, began to bruise a deep, angry violet, thick storm clouds rolling over the jagged peaks. By the time Gideon reached the broken spur, the wind was howling again, whipping dust across the yard. He didn't bother taking the gelding to the barn. He vaulted out of the saddle, his boots hitting the dirt hard, and stormed toward the cabin. The heavy oak door was wide open, banging violently against the exterior wall in the wind. Gideon drew his Colt revolver with his right hand, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stepped onto the porch and crossed the threshold. The cabin was in chaos. The quilts were stripped from the bed. The few provisions he kept on the shelves were gone. "Elara!" Gideon roared, using her real name for the first time. The sound of it echoed off the log walls, harsh and accusatory. A shadow moved on the porch. Gideon spun around, lowering the revolver just as Elara backed out of the shadows, dragging a heavy burlap sack filled with stolen supplies. She had tied a woolen shawl tightly around her head and shoulders. Cora stood behind her, clutching her doll, her eyes wide with terror. Lily was huddled against her sister's leg. Elara froze. She looked at the gun in Gideon's hand, then up to his face. She saw the furious, betrayed storm in his bruised sky eyes. And she knew. "A circuit rider stopped by the well an hour ago for a drink," Elara said, her voice shaking, but her chin raised in that familiar stubborn defiance. "He said a man with a badge was in Cutter's Creek showing a picture of a woman and two girls. And your first instinct is to rob me blind and run into a canyon storm?" Gideon barked, holstering his gun with a sharp metallic snap. He stepped out onto the porch, blocking the steps. He was a mountain of a man, an immovable object between her and freedom. "I took only what we need to survive a few days in the foothills," she said, her chest heaving, backing away from him until she hit the log wall of the cabin. "I'll send money back when I find work. I swear it." "Work?" Gideon let out a harsh, humorless laugh that held no warmth. "Who's going to hire a woman with a bounty on her head for arson and attempted murder? You're a wanted criminal, Elara Vance." Cora gasped at hearing her mother's real name. Lily buried her face in Cora's skirt. Elara flinched as if he had struck her. "Let us pass, Gideon. Please. If that Pinkerton finds us here, he'll arrest you for harboring us. They'll hang me and they'll put my girls in a state orphanage. I will not let that happen." She lunged forward, trying to dart past him and down the wooden stairs. Gideon's right hand shot out, catching her by the waist. He was careful not to touch her burned forearms, but his grip was like iron. He hauled her back onto the porch, pulling her flush against his chest so she couldn't bolt. Elara fought him like a cornered wildcat. She thrashed, kicking at his shins, her uninjured fists pounding against his broad chest. Let me go, damn you! You wouldn't last 2 nights out there, Gideon roared over the wind, easily absorbing her blows, refusing to release her. There are wolves, mountain lions, and a drop in temperature that will freeze those girls in their sleep. You are not running. I have to, she screamed, tears of absolute profound desperation finally spilling over her lashes, mixing with the dust on her face. Her fight broke. Her legs gave out, and she sagged against him, her hands fisting in the fabric of his shirt. He'll take them, Gideon. If they catch me, Malachi will take my babies. Gideon froze. The name hung in the turbulent air between them. Malachi. He looked down at the woman trembling violently against his chest. She wasn't a cold-blooded killer. She was a mother who had looked straight into the fires of hell to protect her children, and she was terrified to her very bones. Gideon's anger, the bitter sting of her deception, evaporated into the howling Wyoming wind. His protective instinct, the same instinct that had driven him to dive under the hooves of a wild Mustang, reared up, vast and unyielding. He wrapped his good arm fully around her, pulling her tightly against his heart, anchoring her to the earth. Stop running, Gideon commanded, his voice dropping to a fierce, ragged whisper right against her ear. Stop running and tell me the damn truth, Elara. Who is Malachi, and why did you burn him out? I didn't just run, Gideon, Elara yelled over the sudden violent crack of thunder that rattled the porch floorboards, her voice raw and breaking. She shoved against his solid chest, but he refused to let her go. I burned his empire to the ground to wipe away his lies. You're harboring an arsonist. Gideon didn't flinch. He didn't loosen his one-armed grip around her waist. He just stared down into her tear-streaked face as the Wyoming storm unleashed its fury around them. Inside, he ordered gruffly. He practically carried her back across the threshold, kicking the heavy oak door shut against the howling wind and sliding the iron bolt home. The sudden quiet of the cabin was deafening, save for the rain hammering the tin roof. Cora and Lily were huddled on the bed, their eyes wide and terrified. Gideon guided Elara to the chair by the hearth and pushed her down into it. He stood over her, his broad chest heaving, his injured arm secured tightly in its sling. He looked like an avenging angel carved from granite. Talk, he commanded, his bruised sky eyes pinning her to the spot. Who is Malachi Vance? Elara covered her face with her scarred hands, a broken sob tearing from her throat. The walls were closing in. The Pinkerton was miles away, hunting her. There was no more running. He was my husband's brother, she began, the words spilling out of her in a jagged, bleeding rush. When my husband died of cholera last year, Malachi stepped in. He said he was managing the estate in Laramie, but he was bleeding it dry. He is a cruel, empty man, Gideon. He looked at my daughters not as family, but as property, as leverage. Gideon's jaw hardened, the muscles ticking beneath his scruff. Go on. Elara lowered her hands, her gaze shifting to Lily, who was watching them with silent, hollow eyes. One evening, Lily accidentally spilled a pitcher of water on his ledger. She was only 4. Malachi, he backhanded her so hard she hit the stone floor. She hasn't spoken a single word since that night. A dark, lethal shadow crossed Gideon's face. His right hand drifted unconsciously toward the heavy leather gun belt strapped to his hip. I'll kill him. I tried to leave the next morning, Elara continued, her voice trembling with the memory. But Malachi laughed at me. He pulled out a legal document, a guardianship order signed by a corrupt county judge who owes Malachi thousands in gambling debts. It declared me an unfit mother, destitute and hysterical. It gave Malachi total legal custody of my girls. If I tried to run, he said he would have me hanged for kidnapping, and he would put Cora and Lily in an asylum. Gideon went perfectly still, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. The document. It was locked in his estate office, Elara whispered, looking down at her mangled, blistered palms. It was the only copy with the judge's seal. Without it, he had no legal right to stop me from leaving the county. So I waited until midnight. I locked the doors of the office from the outside. I poured kerosene over the floorboards, and I struck a match. She looked up, meeting his gaze with a fierce, uncompromising defiance. The fire spread to the thoroughbred stables. I didn't care. I stood there and watched it burn to ashes until I was sure that paper was gone. I burned my hands pulling my girls out of the house, and I stole a wagon, and I ran. If that makes me a monster, Gideon, then I am a monster. But I will die before I let that man touch my children again. The silence in the cabin was profound, heavy with the weight of her confession. Gideon stared at the fierce, scarred, terrified woman sitting in front of him. He didn't see an arsonist. He didn't see a criminal. He saw a mother who had walked through the fires of hell to protect her own. He saw the exact kind of courage he had prayed for in the dark, lonely nights since his own family had been taken from him. The Pinkerton detective was in Cutter's Creek. Malachi Vance had put a bounty on her head, framing a desperate act of survival as cold-blooded attempted murder. An unmarried, destitute woman with 2 children wouldn't stand a chance against extradition laws and a bought and paid-for judge. But Wyoming territory had its own jurisdiction, and Gideon Thorne possessed a ruthless protective streak that ran deeper than the canyon rivers. Gideon turned away from her, striding toward the corner of the room. He grabbed his heavy canvas duster and his Stetson. "What are you doing?" Elara asked, her heart leaping into her throat. Was he going to turn her in? Was he going to ride to town and bring the Pinkerton back? "Pack a dry bag for the girls," Gideon ordered, pulling the duster over his good shoulder. "Wrap them in wool. We're leaving." "Gideon, please." "I'm not turning you in, Elara," he said, cutting her off, his voice absolute and unyielding. He walked back to her, grabbing her upper arms and pulling her gently but firmly to her feet. A fugitive widow on the run is easy prey. A Pinkerton can drag you across county lines before the sun comes up. He looked down into her wide, fearful eyes, his own burning with a dark, intense fire. "But the legal wife of a Wyoming property owner," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a low, rough rumble. "A woman under the sworn protection of my name. It will take an act of the territorial governor to remove you from this ranch, and I'll bury any man who tries." Elara stopped breathing. "What?" "We are riding into Cutter's Creek right now," Gideon stated, leaving absolutely no room for argument. "We are going to wake Magistrate Harrison, and we are going to sign the registry. You are going to take my name, Elara, and then we are going to fight." The ride to Cutter's Creek was a brutal, mud-soaked nightmare. Hidden by the torrential rain and the dead of night, Gideon drove the buckboard wagon through the washed-out ruts, his right arm doing the work of 2 as he handled the reins. Elara sat beside him, shielding Cora and Lily beneath a heavy oilskin tarp. They bypassed the main street, where the saloon lights spilled yellow into the mud, and where Amos Slate, the Pinkerton, was likely drinking whiskey. Instead, Gideon pulled the wagon around to the back alley of Magistrate Harrison's clapboard house. It took 10 minutes of pounding on the back door and a $20 gold eagle slapped onto the kitchen table to get the groggy, annoyed magistrate to open his ledger. Harrison squinted at them through his spectacles, his nightshirt wrinkled. "You look like half-drowned rats, Thorne. This couldn't wait till sunrise?" "No," Gideon said flatly, his imposing frame blocking the doorway. "Sign the paper, Harrison." Elara's hand shook violently as she took the pen. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, the ink hovering over the parchment. She looked at Gideon. He nodded once, a silent, immovable vow of protection. She signed her true name, Elara Thorne. By the time they returned to the broken spur, the adrenaline that had kept Elara upright was rapidly bleeding away, replaced by a deep, bone-chilling cold. Gideon carried the sleeping girls into the cabin, tucking them beneath the heavy quilts on the bed. They didn't even stir, utterly exhausted by the terror of the day. Elara stood shivering by the dying hearth, her wet cloak dripping onto the floorboards. She was a wanted woman. She was a bride. She was entirely at the mercy of a man she had lied to since the moment she crossed his threshold. Gideon locked the heavy door, throwing the iron bolt with a definitive ringing clack. He turned to face her. The cabin was cast in deep shadows, lit only by the faint, pulsing orange glow of the embers. He stepped closer, the sheer masculine mass of him consuming the small space. Water dripped from the brim of his Stetson, casting his bruised sky eyes in dark, dangerous relief. He didn't say a word as he reached out with his good hand. He undid the clasp of her soaked woolen cloak, peeling the heavy, freezing fabric from her trembling shoulders and letting it drop to the floor. Ilara gasped, her breath catching in her throat. The air between them was suddenly thick, electric, and suffocatingly intimate. "Gideon," she whispered, a tremble in her voice that had nothing to do with the cold. He took another step, backing her slowly until her shoulders hit the rough pine logs of the cabin wall. He didn't trap her, but there was nowhere else in the world she could possibly go. He reached up, his calloused thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw, wiping away a streak of rain and mud. "You lied to me," he murmured, his voice a low, rough rasp that vibrated straight through her chest. "I had to," she breathed, looking up into his intense gaze, her heart hammering wildly. "I know." He lowered his head, his face mere inches from hers. The scent of rain, leather, and pure, concentrated male heat washed over her. "But there are no more lies, Ilara. Not in this cabin. Not with me." He looked down at her hands, still hovering defensively near her chest. Slowly, reverently, he took her scarred, blistered wrists in his massive right hand. He didn't look at the burns with pity or disgust. He looked at them like they were medals of honor. He lifted her hands to his mouth, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the scarred flesh of her knuckles. A choked sob escaped Ilara's lips. The tenderness of the gesture, coming from a man so hardened by grief and violence, completely unraveled her. Gideon dropped her hands and framed her face. "You are mine to protect now," he whispered fiercely against her lips. "No Pinkerton, no judge, and sure as hell no ghost from Laramie is ever going to touch you or those girls again. Do you hear me?" "Yes," she breathed. The tension that had been coiling tight between them for days finally, violently snapped. Gideon's mouth came down on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was raw, desperate, and deeply possessive. All the terror of the storm, the fear of losing her to the hangman's noose, and the explosive, undeniable physical craving he had fought since she first walked into his yard poured into the kiss. Ilara let out a soft moan, her hands flying up to grip the lapels of his open duster. She kissed him back with equal starving ferocity, her mouth opening to the hot, demanding sweep of his tongue. She tasted whiskey, rain, and salvation. Gideon groaned, a guttural sound deep in his chest. Because of his injured left shoulder, he couldn't hold her the way he wanted to. But he used his powerful right arm to wrap around her waist, lifting her entirely off the floor and pressing her flush against the log wall. Ilara's legs instinctively wrapped around his hips, anchoring herself to his solid strength. She buried her face in the crook of his neck, her scarred hands tangling in his damp, dark hair. He carried her that way, blind with need, across the small room toward the thick woolen rug laid out before the hearth. He lowered her down gently, following her to the floor, his massive frame blanketing hers. In the dim, flickering light of the fire, they stripped away the cold, wet layers of their clothes. There was no hesitation, no modesty left between them. They had bared their darkest secrets. Now, they bared their skin. Gideon worshipped her with a fierce, burning reverence. He mapped every inch of her shivering body with his mouth and his calloused, gentle hand, learning the soft curves and the sharp edges of the woman who had brought life back into his dead heart. When he finally shifted over her, settling his weight between her thighs, Ilara reached up, pulling his face down to hers. "Gideon," she whispered, her eyes shining with tears of absolute surrender. He drove into her, a deep, breathless joining that made them both cry out softly in the dark cabin. It was a claiming, a physical sealing of the vow they had sworn in the magistrate's office. He moved within her with a slow, powerful rhythm anchored by her touch, anchoring her in return. As the storm raged outside, pounding furiously against the tin roof, Gideon and Alara found their sanctuary in the heat of each other's arms, binding their fractured souls together in the ashes of the past. The marriage certificate registered in the Cutters Creek courthouse did exactly what Gideon intended. It built an impenetrable legal wall around Alara. When Amos Slate, the Pinkerton detective, discovered that the fugitive widow was now the legal wife of a prominent Wyoming landowner, his jurisdiction evaporated. Without an extradition order signed by the territorial governor himself, Slate couldn't lay a finger on her. The Pinkerton packed his bags and left town. But the paper trail they had created served as a beacon, cutting through the vast expanse of the West, straight to the Broken Spur. 3 days after the storm, Gideon rode into Cutters Creek to load a wagon with feed and winter supplies. His left shoulder was still bound in a sling, aching with a dull, persistent throb, but the suffocating weight that had crushed his chest for 2 years was gone. He had a family to provide for. He had a wife waiting for him. He had just hefted a 50-pound sack of oats into the back of the buckboard with his good arm, when the scent of expensive sweet tobacco cut through the smell of horse sweat and dust. "I have to admit, Mr. Thorne," a smooth, cultured voice drew out from the boardwalk shadows, "when I hired the Pinkerton, I expected him to find a desperate woman freezing in a canyon. I certainly didn't expect him to find her playing house with a local rancher." Gideon turned slowly. A custom-tailored charcoal wool suit had absolutely no business in the mud-choked streets of Cutters Creek, but the man wearing it wore it like armor. Malachi Vance was a handsome man with silver touches at his temples and a smile that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. He took a slow drag from a cheroot, exhaling a plume of white smoke into the Wyoming breeze. Flanking Malachi were 2 men who didn't wear tailored suits. They wore scuffed leather, low-slung gun belts, and the unmistakable hard-eyed expressions of men who killed for a wage. Gideon didn't flinch. His right hand rested casually on the edge of the wagon, inches from the butt of his holstered Colt. "You're a long way from Laramie," Gideon said, his voice a low, lethal gravel. "And you are holding something that belongs to me," Malachi replied, stepping off the boardwalk. His polished boots sank slightly into the dirt, but he didn't seem to notice. "I don't care about the woman. Alara is damaged goods, a hysterical fire-starting liability. You can keep her for all I care. But the children are my blood. They are my legal wards, and I've come to take them home." "They're my daughters now," Gideon stated flatly, his bruised sky eyes locking onto Malachi with a terrifying lack of emotion. "By law and by name." Malachi's polished smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He took another step forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let's be reasonable, Thorne. I know what she did. She burned my estate to the ground. She's an arsonist and a thief. If I take this to the territorial governor, I will see her hang. I will make sure she swings from a rope in Cheyenne, and I will take the girls anyway. Hand them over, and I ride away. You keep your ranch. She keeps her life." It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. A wealthy, connected man offering a perfectly logical, perfectly devastating compromise. Gideon looked at the 2 hired guns, analyzing their stances, their weapon placements, the slight twitch in the taller one's jaw. Then he looked back at Malachi. "You listen to me, you son of a bitch," Gideon said softly, the quietness of his tone far more terrifying than a shout. "You touch one hair on my wife's head. You look at my daughters the wrong way, and I won't bother with the law. You step foot on the Broken Spur, I won't even dig a hole. I'll leave you for the coyotes." Malachi's eyes narrowed, the veneer of the civilized gentleman cracking to reveal the rotting malice beneath. He dropped his cigar into the mud and ground it out beneath his heel. "You are making a fatal mistake for a woman you barely know," Malachi hissed. "No," Gideon corrected, pulling himself up onto the wagon seat and taking the reins in his right hand. I'm making a promise. Go back to Laramie, Vance, before you bleed out in the dirt. Gideon clicked his tongue, urging the team of horses forward. He didn't look back as he drove out of Cutter's Creek, but he could feel the crosshairs fixed on his spine. The legal battle was over. The real war had just begun. The sun was bleeding a deep, wounded red over the western ridges by the time Gideon pulled the wagon into the yard of the Broken Spur. Ilara was waiting on the porch. The moment she saw the grim, rigid set of his jaw, the fragile peace they had built over the last 3 days shattered. She rushed down the steps, her skirts dusting the dry dirt. "What happened?" she asked, her hands instinctively reaching out to grip his belt as he stepped down from the wagon. "Is it the Pinkerton?" "Worse," Gideon said heavily, wrapping his good arm around her and pulling her tight against his chest. He kissed the top of her head, drawing strength from the scent of her hair. "It's Malachi. He's in town." Ilara went entirely rigid. The breath completely left her lungs. He found us." "He found my name on the registry," Gideon corrected, guiding her toward the cabin. "He brought 2 guns for hire. He wants the girls, Ilara. But he didn't bring a sheriff. He didn't bring a warrant. He tried to intimidate me into handing them over." Once inside the heavy oak door, Ilara spun away from him, pacing the small floorboards like a trapped cat. Her scarred hands were shaking violently. "We have to run. Gideon, you don't know what he's capable of. He won't fight you fair. He'll wait until you're in the fields, or he'll burn this cabin down with us inside." "Ilara, stop!" Gideon caught her shoulders, halting her frantic pacing. "We aren't running. You are my wife. This is my land. He has to come through me." Before Ilara could argue, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed in the yard. Gideon shoved Ilara behind him and drew his Colt in one fluid, lightning-fast motion, leveling the heavy barrel at the door. "Gid, it's Eli," the muffled voice of the sheriff called out. Gideon lowered the hammer, keeping the gun drawn as he unbolted the door. Sheriff Tate stood on the porch, his horse lathered and blowing hard. Eli wasn't wearing his usual calm demeanor. He looked deeply shaken. He held a sealed yellow envelope in his hand. "Telegram came over the wire 20 minutes after you left town," Eli said, stepping inside and pulling the door shut behind him. He looked at Ilara, offering a tight, respectful nod, before turning back to Gideon. "It's from Thomas Garrett, your lawyer in Cheyenne." Gideon took the envelope, tearing it open with his teeth and his good hand. He unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the staccato, capitalized text. As he read, the blood drained from Gideon's face. "What is it?" Ilara asked, stepping out from behind his broad back, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Gideon handed the telegram to Eli. "Read it." Eli adjusted his sight and read aloud. "Investigated Malachi Vance. Stop custody claim fraudulent. Stop late husband's estate sits on massive silver vein. Stop Vance in debt to Denver mining syndicate for tens of thousands. Stop Vance needs girls, guardianship to legally liquidate land. Stop syndicate gave Vance until end of month to pay or forfeit his life. Stop Vance is cornered. Stop extreme danger. Stop protect the family at all costs. Stop." The silence in the cabin was absolute. "Silver," Ilara whispered, her legs suddenly giving out. She sank into one of the wooden chairs, her hands covering her mouth. "It was never about the girls. It was never about family or blood. He was selling my daughter's inheritance to pay off his gambling debts." "And without that paper you burned in Laramie, he couldn't sell the land," Gideon said, the sheer, terrifying magnitude of her actions finally clicking into place. "You didn't just stall him, Ilara. You bankrupted him." "Which means," Sheriff Tate added grimly, resting his hand on the butt of his revolver, "Malachi Vance is a dead man walking. If he doesn't get those girls and force a judge to sign a new deed, the Denver syndicate will gut him." Gideon looked toward the bed where Cora and Lily were sitting up, watching the adults with wide, fearful eyes. Malachi wasn't an arrogant, wealthy landowner playing legal games anymore. He was a desperate, cornered animal facing his own execution. He didn't care about the law. He didn't care about the Pinkertons. And he certainly didn't care about Gideon's marriage certificate. He was going to come to the broken spur, and he was going to kill anyone standing between him and his survival. "Eli," Gideon said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "Can I count on the law tonight?" Eli shook his head slowly. "I can swear in a couple of deputies, Gid, but they're store clerks and farmers. Against syndicate gun thugs, it'll be a slaughter. I'll ride out here and stand with you, but we're on our own." "No," Gideon said firmly. "You stay in town. If Malachi's men try to circle around or hit the telegraph office, you stop them. This is my property. I'll handle the trespassers." Eli looked at his old friend, recognizing the cold, unyielding light in Gideon's eyes. It was the look of a man going to war. He nodded once, tipped his hat to Ilara, and slipped back out into the gathering twilight. Gideon threw the heavy iron bolt on the door. He walked to the corner of the cabin and pulled a heavy wooden crate from beneath a stack of blankets. He kicked the lid open, revealing a small arsenal, a Winchester repeating rifle, a double-barreled shotgun, and boxes of brass ammunition. Ilara watched him break open the shotgun and load 2 shells into the breeches. Her chest was tight with a terror so profound it threatened to paralyze her. But as she looked at her daughters, at Lily's small, trusting face, the terror burned away, leaving behind a cold, sharp core of absolute fury. She was done running. Ilara stood up from the chair. She walked across the small cabin, her skirts swishing softly against the floorboards, and stopped beside Gideon. She didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She looked down into the crate, her scarred hands steady as she reached in and pulled out the heavy Winchester rifle. Gideon paused, looking at her in surprise. "My husband was a scholar," Ilara said, her voice quiet but ringing with steel. "He never owned a weapon. I don't know how to shoot." She lifted her bruised, beautiful eyes to meet his. "Show me how to load it." Gideon stared at his wife. He saw the fierce, unyielding courage of a frontier woman who refused to be a victim for one more second of her life. A slow, deadly pride swelled in his chest. "All right," Gideon murmured, stepping close behind her and covering her scarred hands with his. "Let's get to work." Midnight brought a torrential deluge that turned the broken spur into a sprawling lake of black mud. Inside the cabin, the only light came from the dying embers in the hearth. Gideon stood by the window, peering through a crack in the heavy wooden shutters. His Winchester rifle rested easily in his right hand. Ilara sat on the edge of the bed, her arms wrapped fiercely around Cora and Lily. The heavy shotgun lay across her lap, her scarred fingers resting near the triggers, just as Gideon had shown her. They had been waiting for 3 hours in suffocating silence. "They're coming," Gideon murmured, his voice barely audible over the drumming rain. A jagged fork of lightning illuminated the yard for a fraction of a second. It was long enough for Gideon to spot 3 figures dismounting near the tree line. "The cabin is a wooden box. If they throw a torch on the roof, we're smoked out," Gideon said, stepping away from the window. He moved to Ilara in the darkness. "Take the girls out the back door. Keep low. Run to the barn. The foundation is stone, and the timbers are soaked. You barricade yourselves in the tack room." "What about you?" Ilara asked, her voice tight with terror, gripping his good arm. "I'm going out the front," Gideon said smoothly, a deadly cold calm settling over him. "I'm going to make sure they look at me, not you." Before she could argue, a gunshot shattered the stillness. A heavy lead slug tore through the front shutter, embedding itself in the log wall just inches from Gideon's head. Cora screamed, burying her face in Ilara's skirt. "Go!" Gideon roared. Ilara didn't hesitate. She shoved the shotgun into the crook of her arm, grabbed Lily's hand, and pushed Cora toward the rear exit. They slipped out the back door into the freezing, blinding rain. The mud sucked at Ilara's boots, threatening to drag her down, but she pulled her daughters through the darkness, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Behind them, the night erupted. Gideon kicked the front door open, diving onto the muddy porch. He fired the Winchester with his right hand, bracing the heavy barrel against his injured left forearm. The sharp, cracking reports of the rifle cut through the storm. One of the hired guns cried out, dropping into the mud near the water trough. The return fire was immediate and heavy. Wood splintered around Gideon as he rolled off the porch and took cover behind a stack of cordwood. A bullet grazed his ribs, slicing through his oilskin duster and biting into his side like a hot iron. He gritted his teeth, pumped the lever of the Winchester, and fired again. Through the chaos of the gunfight, Elara reached the heavy sliding doors of the barn. She pushed them open just enough to slip the girls inside, then hauled them shut. The interior was pitch black, smelling of damp hay, leather, and nervous horses. "Stay behind me," Elara whispered, guiding the terrified children toward the fortified tack room at the back. But as they moved down the center aisle, the side door of the barn groaned open. Elara froze. A match flared in the darkness, the sudden hiss of sulfur loud in the cavernous space. The small flame touched the wick of a kerosene lantern, and a circle of yellow light bloomed, illuminating the impeccably tailored, soaking wet figure of Malachi Vance. He didn't have a rifle. He held a silver-plated revolver in one hand and the lit lantern in the other. He smiled, a grotesque twisting of his handsome features. "You always did have a habit of running to barns when you were cornered, Elara," Malachi said, his voice echoing off the rafters. Elara raised the heavy shotgun, her scarred hands trembling so violently the barrels rattled. "Don't take another step." Malachi laughed, a cold, empty sound. He raised the lantern slightly, holding it directly over a massive pile of dry, loose hay stacked near the empty stalls. "I know you, Elara," Malachi purred, stepping closer. "I know the nightmares that keep you awake. I know what the sound of a struck match does to your heart." He tilted the lantern. The glass chimney rattled. "Put the gun down, or I drop this right into the hay. The roof will catch in 3 minutes. You'll roast alive with those brats before your cowboy out there can even reach the door." Panic, pure and blinding, seized Elara's chest. The air in the barn suddenly felt searingly hot. The smell of kerosene triggered a violent flashback. She saw the flames in Laramie. She heard the roaring fire. Her lungs constricted, entirely paralyzed by the PTSD that had haunted her for weeks. Fire. It was the monster that had scarred her flesh and haunted her dreams. "Put it down," Malachi commanded, his smile widening as he saw her lower the shotgun slightly, recognizing her total, paralyzing terror. "Sign the paper I brought and give me the girls. The syndicate gets the land and I walk away." Elara looked at the lantern. Then she looked down. Lily was standing beside her. The tiny, mute 5-year-old wasn't looking at Malachi, and she wasn't looking at the fire. She was looking up at her mother. Lily's small hand reached out and gripped Elara's skirt. It was the exact same gesture she had made when she touched Gideon's knee. A silent plea. An absolute anchor of trust. The terror in Elara's mind vanished, completely incinerated by a sudden volcanic surge of motherly rage. Malachi was banking on her fear. He was expecting the broken, hysterical widow he had created. Elara dropped the shotgun into the dirt. Malachi sneered in triumph, stepping away from the hay. But before he could raise his revolver, Elara lunged. She didn't run away. She didn't scream. She grabbed a massive, soaking, wet woolen horse blanket draped over the nearest stall gate. Using the heavy momentum of the soaked fabric, she threw it directly over Malachi's head and the lantern in his hand. The lantern shattered beneath the heavy, wet wool. The flame was instantly, completely smothered in the darkness. "You bitch!" Malachi screamed, his muffled voice echoing in the pitch-black barn as the heavy, wet blanket tangled around him. His revolver fired blindly into the dirt. Elara didn't hesitate. She tackled him. All the weight of her trauma, her fury, and her desperation went into the impact. They crashed to the hard-packed dirt floor. Malachi fought violently, trying to throw her off, his fist striking her jaw. But Elara fought like a cornered wolf. She scrambled in the dark, her hands desperately searching the dirt until her scarred fingers closed around the cold steel of the shotgun she had dropped. She tore the blanket off his face, shoved the twin barrels of the shotgun directly against Malachi's sternum, and cocked both hammers back with a deafening metallic clack, clack. Malachi froze, staring up into the darkness, his breath hitching. Suddenly, the main barn doors were violently thrown open. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene. Gideon stood in the threshold, bleeding, his chest heaving, his Winchester leveled. Behind him in the yard, Sheriff Eli Tate and a posse of deputies were swarming the surviving hired guns. Gideon's eyes locked onto the center aisle. Elara was kneeling in the dirt, her wet hair plastered to her face. The shotgun pressed hard against the chest of the cowering, terrified man beneath her. Malachi swallowed hard, raising his hands, his arrogant facade completely shattered. Elara, wait! Elara, we're family. I needed fire to hide my weakness before, Malachi, Elara said. Her voice wasn't shaking. It was as cold and hard as Wyoming ice. Here, I don't need it. I have a family. She didn't pull the triggers. She didn't need to. She stepped back, keeping the gun leveled, as Sheriff Eli Tate strode into the barn with a pair of heavy iron cuffs. Gideon dropped his rifle. He crossed the barn in 3 massive strides, pulling Elara into his chest, burying his face in her wet hair. Cora and Lily ran from the tack room, wrapping their arms around Gideon's legs. As Eli dragged a cursing, defeated Malachi Vance out into the rain, Gideon held his wife and his daughters in the dark, breathing in the scent of damp wool, hay, and absolute survival. The storm outside was finally beginning to break. 6 weeks later, the brutal heat of the summer had finally given way to the crisp golden chill of a Wyoming autumn. The dust had settled, both legally and literally. The telegrams from Cheyenne confirmed it. Malachi Vance had been tried, convicted, and sentenced to 20 years in the heavy stone confines of the Wyoming Territorial Penitentiary. The Denver mining syndicate was no longer his salvation. They were his enemies, and a territorial prison cell was the only thing keeping him alive. With Thomas Garrett and the Laramie lawyer, Croft, bringing the massive financial fraud to light, the territorial governor had formally dismissed the arson complaint against Elara. The act was ruled a desperate measure of self-defense against a man attempting to kidnap and defraud an heir. The Laramie estate and the silver vein beneath it was placed in a secure trust for Cora and Lily. But none of the wealth mattered to the people sitting inside the cabin of the Broken Spur. The main ranch house was nearly finished, the framing completed and the roof shingled. But for tonight, they were still in the cabin. The fire in the hearth crackled merrily, casting a warm amber glow across the braided rug. Gideon sat in his armchair, his left arm finally free of its sling. The bullet graze on his ribs was a fading scar. Elara sat on the floor near his feet, a worn book in her lap, reading a story softly to Cora, who was fighting a losing battle with sleep. When Cora finally drifted off, Gideon stood up. He gently lifted the 8-year-old girl and carried her to the bed, tucking her in beside Lily, who was already deep in slumber. He walked back to the hearth, but he didn't sit down. He stood looking into the flames for a long moment. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his leather vest. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy parchment. It was the marriage certificate they had signed in Magistrate Harrison's kitchen in the middle of a thunderstorm, the legal document that had saved her life. Elara looked up, her heart giving a sudden nervous flutter as she recognized the paper. "Gideon?" Gideon looked at her, his bruised sky eyes softer and more open than she had ever seen them. He stepped closer, crouched down before her, and held the document out over the flames of the hearth. He let it drop. Elara gasped softly as the fire licked the edges of the paper, curling the heavy parchment until the ink and the legal jargon dissolved into gray ash. "What are you doing?" she whispered, staring at the embers. "That paper was a shield," Gideon said, his voice a low, steady rumble in the quiet room. He reached out and gently took her scarred hands in his thumbs smoothing over the raised flesh of her burns. "I married you to keep a Pinkerton from putting you on a train. We signed it out of desperation and fear and survival. He looked up, meeting her gaze. The absolute, unshakable devotion in his eyes stole the breath from her lungs. "I don't want a shield anymore, Ilara," he murmured, lifting her hands and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I don't want an arrangement. I don't want a marriage born out of running from ghosts. I want to build a life with the woman who stood in front of a monster to protect her girls. I want to build a life with the woman who patched my arm, who chopped my wood, and who brought light back into the darkest corners of my soul." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. Gideon reached into his pocket again. This time he pulled out a simple, polished band of silver. "I want to marry you because I love you," Gideon whispered fiercely. "Will you stay, Ilara? Not for protection, but for me?" A choked, joyful sob tore from her throat. She didn't bother with words. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder, holding on to him with all the fierce, unyielding strength she possessed. Gideon's arms came around her waist, crushing her to his chest, burying his face in her hair. He slipped the silver band onto her finger, sealing a vow that no court or law could ever touch. The next morning broke clear and brilliant over the Wyoming territory. Gideon and Ilara stood side by side on the wooden porch of the cabin, steaming mugs of coffee in their hands. The vast rolling plains stretched out before them, painted in vivid strokes of morning gold and russet brown. The air smelled of pine, frost, and absolute freedom. Gideon wrapped his arm around Ilara's waist, pulling her flush against his side. She leaned her head against his shoulder, letting out a long, peaceful sigh. The nightmares were gone. The fire was just a memory. Suddenly, a tiny tug at the denim of Gideon's pant leg made them both look down. Lily stood there in her nightgown, her dark hair mussed from sleep. She looked up at the towering rancher. Her dark eyes, once hollow and haunted by silence, were completely clear, bright with the safety of a home she finally understood. She reached her small, grubby arms up toward the giant man. She opened her mouth, and for the first time in a long, agonizing year, a sound broke past her lips. It was a tiny, fragile, beautiful whisper. "Pa," Lily said. "Up." Gideon Thorne's eyes filled with tears. He smiled, a full, unburdened smile that reached the deepest corners of his eyes, and he bent down to lift his daughter into the morning light. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.